So the symmetry point is not saving the paper. The symmetry point is actually fine. I'm happy to grant it for the sake of argument. Sure, if you broaden one side, you should willing to broaden the other side symmetrically. Fair enough. But even granting that, you only get this. Weak atheism includes strong atheists and agnostics. Weak theism includes strong theists and agnostics. Agnosticism is the overlap of two broad categories. That is all. That is not a collapse. That is a pair overlapping umbrella labels. That's it. And that's why I wanted to cover this paper, because anybody can understand that. It's just that all this, heavy mathematical and logical language can be overwhelming. You don't need to go through all this. So we can grant symmetry, we can grant weak theism as a category, that's fine. All you get is that agnostics fall under both weak labels. That doesn't mean that the labels are equivalent to agnosticism, right? Because those labels still cover strong theists and strong atheists respectively. So the core inferential mistake here is that the paper identifies the agnostic remainder of each weak category, the part left over when you remove the corresponding strong case, and then treats that remainder as though it exhausts the entire category, when it doesn't. He is proving a sub-case, then renames it as the whole case. That's what he is doing. Holy shucks, this is beautiful. Look, that's what I mean. So how did Steve forget this one? So he's saying that this category is a collapse, not an overlap, like agnostic is a collapse. But that's not a collapse, that's an overlap. Right? Even in the diagram, it's an overlap. It's not a collapse. How did he forget this one? I don't get it. I think so he's flipped it. He thinks that the strong atheism overlaps the weak atheism. I think so that's where he's got it wrong. If weak atheism, like we see in this diagram, right? If it's just agnosticism, then what do we call a person who positively believes there is no God, who still on paper's own definition counts as a weak atheist? Right? This one here. So the moment you ask the question, right, that question, right, what do we call a person who positively believes there's no God? And so who on paper still counts as a weak atheist? Because according to them, agnosticism is just weak atheism. Like, no, it's an overlap, not a collapse. So this whole section was, I'll take this picture out of the way. But this whole section, this one, right? With all this, with all this here, was supposed to be the climax of the paper, but actually gives away the problem more clearly, or most clearly. It highlights the problem. It shows that weak categories are broad enough to include agnostics. It does not show that weak categories reduce to agnosticism. That's false. So if we remember one point from this whole exercise we've done today, is that agnosticism sits inside the overlap of the weak categories. It does not replace them. So the conclusion is, we are therefore forced to conclude that by accepting the entreaty of the presumption of atheism, to have atheism to be understood in the negative or weak case condition, it would be semantically possible to by subalternation, merger for subject to be an atheist, theist, and an agnostic at the same time due to semantic collapse, given the allowance of labeling of the weaker case conditions of the alternations as theism and atheism. We saw in the diagram that's not how it works, right? The semantic collapse renders these terms therefore ambiguous. Again, those are two different things. Having more than one usage and the distinction being distinct are two different things. So Steve has gotten that wrong too, in my opinion. Or at best redundant, and consequently should subject the request of the presumption of atheism to have atheism understood in the negative to avoid semantic collapse of terms. So we have now arrived at the conclusion, and the conclusion says, in effect, that accepting clues weak or negative case condition for atheism makes it semantically possible for a subject to be atheist, theist, and agnostic at the same time, right? I'm repeating myself, because there's a semantic collapse. So this is where the quiet part is being said loud, right? It claims not just that broad labels can overlap, not just that terms can become blurry, but that categories collapse badly enough for the whole proposal should be rejected. Again, conclusion is stronger than the argument. What has been shown? At most, if you use weak broad senses of atheism and theism, then agnostics may fall under both broad labels. That is the actual result, right? If we use them in broad sense. So, and even if we are like generous, right? If we go very generous, we could say, yeah, broad labeling creates confusion. Ordinary response to confusion is clarification. How you clarify? You distinguish the strong from weak. You distinguish assertive disbelief from mere non-belief. You do not need to say the entire framework implodes. So, in my opinion, this is what the conclusion should have said. Using broad, weak senses of theism and atheism may cause agnostics to fall under both umbrella labels, which can create ambiguity unless the strong and weak senses are kept distinct. That could be a modest, and you could defend a modest conclusion that can be defended. But it makes a much bigger conclusion, which is less defensible. And if we go back and look at it, there's one more important point here, right? The conclusion says that terms become ambiguous or at best redundant, but these are not the same charge, right? As I said, collapse and ambiguous are not the same thing. Ambiguous means one label may refer to more than one kind of case. Redundant means label no longer adds anything distinct at all. And the paper has not proven redundancy, in my opinion. It never proves the weak atheism and weak theism do no independent classificatory work. In fact, the whole paper depends on them doing independent classificatory work in order to run the square at all, right? Yeah, so even paper's own rhetoric, it's wobbly between several levels of criticism. Ambiguity, overlap, redundancy, collapse. These are not interchangeable. You cannot interchange these terms. That's not how it works. My verdict is that the paper identifies a possible ambiguity in broad labeling, but then it overstates that ambiguity into a thesis of semantic collapse. And it reaches that overstatement by confusing broad category membership with identity of positions. So Steve may need to go back and revisit these definitions and clarify them and rewrite the paper accordingly. So some of the faults that I observed as I was going through this paper was it confuses not believing a claim with believing the opposite claim. That's huge. Not believing that God exists is not the same thing as believing God does not exist. Second, it misapplied bivalence. Either God exists or not exists, yeah, fine, but it does not follow that every subject believes one side or the other. So that's misapplication of bivalence, in my opinion. Third, it mistakes one-way implication for equivalence. Right? Strong atheism implies weak atheism, but weak atheism is broader than strong atheism. Same on the theist side. Fourth, and I think so, it's the most important, it mistakes overlap between broad categories for collapse of distinct positions. So the in my conclusion, the paper raises a real question about language, but it does not solve it well. Its formal, accessories apparatus gives the appearance of a knockdown result, but the result does not follow. The categories do not collapse, the labels overlap.